the teleprinter clattered to life in Hut 3, breaking the concentrated silence that had settled over the night shift like fog over the Thames. Section Officer Margaret Hartley looked up from the decrypt she had been annotating, her pen hovering over a reference to Wehrmacht supply movements in Normandy. The teleprinter was connected directly to Station X's main intercept facility, and messages arriving at this hour were typically routine traffic from German administrative units discussing mundane logistics. But something about the urgency of the machine's rhythm made Hartley set down her pen and walk across the room to read the emerging text. The message header indicated it had been intercepted from a high-priority Abwehr circuit, the intelligence service of the German High Command. That alone was unusual. Abwehr traffic at this hour typically consisted of administrative communications or low-level agent reports. This message was different. The classification marking indicated it was from a source designated Arabelle, an agent code that Hartley recognized immediately. Arabelle was the Abwehr's most trusted spy in Britain, an agent who had been providing intelligence to German military intelligence since 1941. His reports were considered so reliable that they were often forwarded directly to Hitler's headquarters. What made Hartley's hands begin to tremble slightly as she read the decrypt was not the source, but the content. Arabelle was reporting that he had discovered the location and timing of the Allied invasion of Europe. According to his message, a massive military force was assembling in southeastern England, preparing to invade France at Pas-de-Calais in mid-July. The report included specific details, division numbers, equipment types, embarkation schedules, and even the names of commanding officers. It was exactly the kind of intelligence that could allow the Germans to position their forces to repel the invasion before it could establish a beachhead. Hartley read the message 3 times, her mind racing through the implications. If this intelligence was accurate, and the Germans believed it, the invasion would fail. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers would die on the beaches, and the war in Europe would be prolonged indefinitely. But something about the message felt wrong. The details were too perfect, too comprehensive. Intelligence reports from field agents were typically fragmentary, based on partial observations and inference. This message read like a military briefing document, complete with organizational charts and operational timelines that no single agent could possibly have compiled. She walked quickly to the office of Major Thomas Whitmore, the senior intelligence officer on duty that night. Whitmore was a veteran of the First World War who had returned to service in 1939, bringing with him 3 decades of experience in military intelligence. He was reading intercepts from the Eastern Front when Hartley entered, and he looked up with the mild irritation of a man interrupted in the middle of complex analysis. But when he saw Hartley's expression, his irritation vanished. He had worked with her long enough to recognize when she had found something significant. "Sir, we have an Arabelle message. He's reporting the invasion location and timing." Hartley handed him the decrypt, watching his face as he read. Whitmore's expression shifted from interest to concern, to something that looked like carefully controlled alarm. He set the decrypt on his desk and removed his reading glasses. A gesture Hartley had learned meant he was about to say something important. "This message is either the most catastrophic intelligence leak of the war, or it's the most brilliant deception operation I've ever seen. We need to determine which, and we need to do it quickly." Whitmore reached for the telephone that connected Hut 3 to the headquarters building, where the senior leadership of Bletchley Park worked. At this hour, most of those offices would be empty. But Whitmore knew that Commander Edward Travis, the deputy director of the Government Code and Cipher School, often worked late into the night. The phone rang 4 times before Travis answered, his voice showing no sign of fatigue despite the hour. Whitmore spoke carefully, aware that even on a secure line, certain details could not be discussed explicitly. "Sir, we have an Arabelle message that requires immediate attention. It concerns the matter we've been monitoring. I believe you should see this personally." Travis arrived in Hut 3 17 minutes later, moving with the brisk efficiency of a naval officer who had spent his career responding to emergencies. He read the decrypt in silence, his face revealing nothing. When he finished, he looked at Whitmore and Hartley with an expression that combined calculation with something that might have been satisfaction. "This message is exactly what we've been waiting for. It confirms that Fortitude is working. The Germans believe Arabelle completely, which means they're about to make the mistake we need them to make." Hartley felt confusion replace her alarm. "Sir, I don't understand. If the Germans believe this intelligence, won't they position their forces to defend against our invasion?" Travis smiled, a rare expression that transformed his usually stern features. "They will indeed position their forces. They'll position them at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that will never come. Because Arabelle isn't a German spy. He's our spy. And every word of that message is a carefully constructed lie, designed to make the Germans look in the wrong direction while we land at Normandy." The revelation struck Hartley with the force of a physical blow. For 3 years, she had been reading Arabelle's reports, watching the Germans respond to his intelligence, believing that somewhere in Britain, a traitor was feeding information to the enemy. The idea that Arabelle was actually a British double agent, that his reports were part of an elaborate deception operation, seemed almost impossible. Yet, as she thought back over the messages she had read, certain patterns began to make sense. Arabelle's intelligence was always accurate enough to maintain German trust, but never quite timely enough to cause real damage. His reports confirmed things the Germans already suspected, rather than revealing genuinely new information. Travis continued, his voice taking on the tone of a lecturer, explaining a complex concept to students. "Arabelle's real name is Juan Pujol Garcia, though we call him Garbo because of his acting abilities. He's a Spanish businessman who volunteered to work for us in 1941. The Germans think he's running a network of sub-agents across Britain. In reality, every one of those sub-agents is fictional. Garbo creates them, gives them personalities and backgrounds, and writes reports as if they were real people. The Germans have been paying him for intelligence from imaginary spies for 3 years. But, sir," Whitmore interjected, "if the Germans discover that Arabelle is feeding them false information, won't that compromise the entire deception?" Travis nodded slowly. "That's the risk we're taking. Garbo has built his credibility over 3 years by providing intelligence that was accurate but not damaging. Now we're asking him to provide intelligence that is completely false but absolutely critical. If the Germans believe him, we win. If they doubt him, we lose not just the deception, but potentially the war itself. Everything depends on whether Garbo has built enough trust to make the Germans believe the impossible." The 3 of them stood in the quiet of Hut 3, surrounded by the machinery of code breaking and intelligence analysis, contemplating the enormous gamble that was about to unfold. Somewhere in London, Juan Pujol Garcia was crafting messages that would be transmitted to Madrid and forwarded to Berlin. Those messages would tell the Germans exactly what they wanted to hear: that the Allies were preparing to invade at Pas-de-Calais, the most obvious and heavily defended point on the French coast. And if the Germans believed those messages, they would keep their strongest forces away from Normandy, where the real invasion would land in just 3 weeks. Juan Pujol Garcia sat in a windowless interrogation room, facing 2 British intelligence officers who regarded him with undisguised skepticism. He was 30 years old, slightly built, with the unremarkable appearance of a provincial shopkeeper. His suit was worn but clean, his manner polite but insistent. For the past 45 minutes, he had been trying to convince the officers that he was a Spanish businessman who had spent the last 9 months pretending to be a German spy while actually working against the Nazis. The officers, Major Thomas Robertson and Captain Cyril Mills, had heard many implausible stories during their careers in counterintelligence, but Pujol's tale was extraordinary even by their standards. Pujol spoke in careful English, occasionally searching for words, but generally communicating with surprising fluency for someone who claimed to have learned the language largely from books and BBC radio broadcasts. His story began in Madrid in January 1941, when he had approached the German embassy offering to spy for the Abwehr. His motivation, he explained, was not ideological sympathy with Nazism, but rather a passionate hatred of totalitarianism born from his experiences during the Spanish Civil War. He had seen both fascists and communists commit atrocities, and he had concluded that the only way to preserve human freedom was to help defeat Hitler. The Germans had been initially suspicious of his offer, as they were of all volunteer agents, but Pujol had been persistent, returning to the embassy repeatedly with proposals for how he could gather intelligence for Germany. He claimed to have business contacts in Britain who could help him establish himself in London. He presented himself as a man motivated by money and a vague sympathy for the German cause. Eventually, the Abwehr had agreed to train him as an agent, providing him with invisible ink, codes, and instructions for establishing a spy network in Britain. They gave him the code name Arabelle and sent him to Lisbon with money and instructions to make his way to England. But Pujol had never gone to England. Instead, he had remained in Lisbon and begun fabricating intelligence reports based on information he gathered from newspapers, magazines, reference books, and his own imagination. He created fictional sub-agents who supposedly lived in different parts of Britain and reported on military activities they observed. He invented personalities for these imaginary spies, giving them names, occupations, and personal characteristics. One was a Welsh nationalist who hated the English. Another was a Portuguese commercial traveler who moved around Britain on business. A third was a Venezuelan student studying in Glasgow. The reports Pujol sent to Madrid were detailed and plausible, describing military convoys, troop movements, and defensive installations. The information was based on educated guesses about what British forces might be doing, combined with details gleaned from public sources. Sometimes his guesses were surprisingly accurate. Other times they were completely wrong. But the Abwehr believed him. They paid him regularly, praised his work, and asked for more intelligence. For 9 months, Pujol had maintained this elaborate fiction, sending reports from Lisbon while pretending to be in London. Robertson and Mills listened to this story with professional skepticism. Double agents were valuable assets in counterintelligence work, but they were also dangerous. An agent who claimed to be working for Britain while actually serving Germany could cause immense damage. The officers needed to determine whether Pujol was genuine or whether this entire story was itself a deception designed to infiltrate British intelligence. They questioned him for hours, probing for inconsistencies, testing his knowledge, trying to trap him in contradictions. What gradually convinced them of Pujol's authenticity was not any single piece of evidence, but rather the accumulation of details that would have been almost impossible to fabricate. Pujol produced copies of messages he had sent to the Abwehr, showing the progression of his fictional spy network over 9 months. He explained how he had made mistakes in his early reports, describing British currency in pesetas because he didn't understand the pound system, or placing military units in locations where they couldn't possibly be because he was working from outdated maps. These errors were exactly the kind that a real German agent in Britain would not have made, but that someone pretending to be in Britain from Portugal might make. More convincingly, Pujol explained how the Abwehr had responded to his reports. They had questioned some of his information, asked for clarification on certain points, and occasionally expressed concern about details that didn't match their other intelligence sources. But they had never accused him of fabricating reports or suspected that he wasn't actually in Britain. This suggested that either Pujol was an extraordinarily skilled deceiver or his story was true. The officers were beginning to believe it was the latter. Robertson, who headed MI5's double agent program known as the 20 Committee or Double Cross System, saw immediately the potential value of an agent the Germans already trusted. The challenge of running double agents was always establishing credibility with the enemy. It could take months or years to build the trust necessary to feed the Germans false information they would believe. But Pujol had already done that work. He had spent 9 months building a reputation with the Abwehr as a productive and reliable source. If MI5 could take over the operation, they would inherit that credibility and could use it to deceive the Germans on a scale that would otherwise be impossible. But there were risks. If the Germans discovered that Arabelle had been turned, they would know that all his previous intelligence was suspect. They might conclude that other agents were also compromised. The entire double-cross system could be endangered. Robertson needed to be certain that Pujol was genuine before bringing him into the program. He decided to test the Spanish volunteer with a challenge that would reveal whether he was truly committed to working against Germany or whether this was an elaborate penetration attempt. "Mr. Pujol," Robertson said, leaning forward across the table, "you've told us a remarkable story. You claim to have deceived the German intelligence service for 9 months while working alone in Lisbon. You say you want to help Britain defeat Hitler. I'm prepared to believe you, but I need proof. I need you to demonstrate that you can do what you claim. I want you to send a message to the Abwehr from here, from London, and I want to see how they respond. If they believe you're still their loyal agent, we'll talk about how you can work for us." Pujol agreed, without hesitation. Over the next 3 days, working with MI5 handlers who monitored his every action, he composed and transmitted a message to Madrid reporting his arrival in Britain and describing the intelligence opportunities he had identified. The message was written in Pujol's established style, using the codes and procedures the Abwehr had taught him. It contained information that was accurate, but not sensitive, the kind of intelligence that would maintain his credibility without causing damage to British security. The Abwehr's response arrived 4 days later. They welcomed Arabel's arrival in Britain, congratulated him on successfully establishing himself in London, and requested specific intelligence about military installations in southeastern England. The message included payment instructions and encouragement to expand his network of subagents. It was exactly the response that would come to an agent they trusted completely. Robertson read the message and made his decision. Juan Pujol Garcia would become Agent Garbo, the most important double agent in the war against Germany. What neither Pujol nor his MI5 handlers could know in April 1942 was that this decision would eventually lead to the most critical deception operation of the war. Over the next 2 years, Garbo would build his fictional spy network into an elaborate organization of 27 imaginary sub-agents, each with detailed backgrounds and personalities. He would send hundreds of messages to Madrid, mixing accurate but harmless intelligence with carefully crafted deceptions. He would become so trusted by the Abwehr that his reports would be forwarded directly to Hitler's headquarters and used to make strategic decisions. And in May 1944, 2 years after that first meeting in the MI5 interrogation room, Garbo would send the message that would save D-Day by convincing the Germans to look in the wrong direction while the largest amphibious invasion in history unfolded on the beaches of Normandy. But that message would only work because of the foundation of trust that Pujol was beginning to build in the spring of 1942, one carefully crafted lie at a time. Juan Pujol sat at the desk in his modest safe house, surrounded by files containing the biographical details of people who did not exist. His MI5 handler, Thomas Harris, stood by the window smoking a cigarette and watching Pujol work with the fascination of an artist observing a master craftsman. For the past 6 months, Garbo had been expanding his fictional spy network with a creativity and attention to detail that bordered on genius. What had begun as 3 imaginary sub-agents had grown into a complex organization of informants, each with their own personality, motivation, and area of expertise. Agent 1 was the original Venezuelan student in Glasgow, now described as a left-wing idealist, who opposed British imperialism and believed Germany represented a progressive force in world affairs. Pujol had given him the name Carlos and created a detailed backstory involving studies at the University of Glasgow, financial difficulties, and growing disillusionment with British society. Carlos supposedly recruited his own sub-agents, including a Scottish nationalist who worked at a military supply depot and a Greek sailor who traveled between British ports. These sub-agents of sub-agents existed only in Pujol's imagination, but the Abwehr believed in them completely. Agent 2 was the Swiss businessman based in Bootle, near Liverpool, who Pujol had named Gerbers. This character was motivated purely by money, with no ideological commitment to either side. Gerbers supposedly had commercial contacts throughout northwestern England and could observe shipping movements in Liverpool Harbor. Pujol had created a wife for Gerbers, describing her as suspicious of her husband's activities and potentially a security risk. This domestic detail added authenticity to the character and gave Pujol a reason to occasionally limit Gerbers' reporting when MI5 needed to restrict the flow of information to Germany. Agent 3 was the Venezuelan commercial traveler named Pedro, who supposedly moved around Britain selling goods and observing military activities. Pedro was characterized as enthusiastic, but somewhat careless, occasionally making mistakes in his reports that Pujol would have to correct in subsequent messages. This character allowed Pujol to introduce deliberate errors into his intelligence that would later be corrected, a technique that enhanced his credibility by making his network seem more realistic. Real spy networks made mistakes, and by acknowledging and correcting errors, Pujol made his fictional network more believable. The genius of Pujol's system was not just the creation of individual characters, but the relationships between them. He constructed a network that functioned like a real intelligence organization, with agents recruiting sub-agents, personality conflicts creating operational problems, and administrative challenges requiring constant attention. One agent would fall ill and be unable to report for weeks. Another would demand more money and threaten to quit. A third would become frightened after a close call with security services and need reassurance. These human complications made the network feel authentic to the Abwehr handlers in Madrid. Harris watched Pujol compose a message from Agent 4, a character they had recently introduced as a Gibraltarian waiter working at a military canteen in southern England. The waiter, named Fred, was described as simple-minded but observant, capable of reporting what he saw, but unable to analyze its significance. This allowed Pujol to provide accurate information about troop movements while appearing to misunderstand their importance. Fred might report seeing soldiers with a particular divisional insignia without realizing that this revealed the location of an entire military unit. The beauty of Fred, Harris observed, exhaling smoke toward the ceiling, is that he allows us to confirm information the Germans already know while appearing to give them something new. They'll feel clever for deducing what Fred's observations mean, which will make them trust him more. Pujol nodded, continuing to write in the careful handwriting that characterized all his messages. He understood instinctively what Harris had learned through years of counterintelligence work. The best way to deceive someone was to let them think they were deceiving you. The messages Pujol sent to Madrid were masterpieces of calculated misdirection. He mixed accurate information about military activities with false details about their purpose and timing. He reported real troop movements, but misidentified the units involved. He described genuine defensive installations, but exaggerated their strength or placed them in slightly wrong locations. The result was intelligence that seemed valuable, but was actually useless or actively misleading. The Germans received a constant stream of information that confirmed their existing assumptions while subtly pushing them toward incorrect conclusions. But maintaining this elaborate deception required extraordinary attention to detail. Pujol kept meticulous records of everything each fictional agent had reported, ensuring consistency across hundreds of messages. He tracked which agents knew each other, who had recruited whom, and what information each character would realistically have access to. He created personality quirks and behavioral patterns for each agent so that their messages had distinctive styles. Carlos wrote in educated language with political commentary. Fred's reports were simple and descriptive. Gerber's was businesslike and focused on financial matters. The Abwehr responded to this intelligence with enthusiasm and increasing trust. They praised Arabel's work, increased his funding, and asked for more detailed reporting on specific targets. They never questioned whether his agents were real. The idea that someone could create and maintain such an elaborate fictional network apparently never occurred to them. They saw what they expected to see: a productive spy ring providing valuable intelligence from inside Britain. The fact that every word was carefully crafted deception remained invisible to them. In November 1942, Pujol faced his first major test. The Allies were preparing Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. British and American forces were assembling in Britain for transport to Morocco and Algeria. The Abwehr was desperately seeking intelligence about Allied intentions, and they pressed Arabel for information about what he was observing. This created a dilemma for Pujol and his MI5 handlers. If Garbo reported nothing about the massive military preparations, his credibility would suffer. But if he reported too much or too accurately, he might compromise the operation. The solution they devised was brilliant in its audacity. Pujol would report the invasion accurately, but too late for the Germans to respond. He composed a detailed message describing the convoy assembling in British ports, correctly identifying it as an invasion force bound for North Africa. But instead of sending the message immediately, he held it for several hours, finally transmitting it in the early morning hours of November 8th, after the invasion had already begun. When the Abwehr received the message, the landings were underway, and it was too late to reinforce the defenses. Pujol then sent an angry follow-up message complaining that Madrid had not been monitoring their radio frequency at the scheduled time, causing a critical delay in receiving his intelligence. He expressed frustration that his excellent intelligence had been wasted because of German incompetence. This was a calculated risk. Criticizing the Abwehr could damage his relationship with his handlers. But it also demonstrated that Arabel was a dedicated agent who cared about the success of his mission. And it established a precedent that would prove crucial later. Sometimes intelligence arrived too late to be useful, and that wasn't necessarily the agent's fault. The Abwehr's response exceeded Pujol's hopes. They apologized profusely for missing his transmission. They acknowledged that his intelligence had been accurate and valuable. They praised his dedication and assured him that procedures would be improved to prevent similar failures in the future. Most importantly, they never questioned why Arabel had waited until the last possible moment to send such critical intelligence. The incident actually enhanced his credibility, demonstrating that he had access to genuine strategic intelligence, even if circumstances sometimes prevented it from being delivered in time. Harris read the Abwehr's apologetic response and smiled with satisfaction. "They've just given us the key to the greatest deception of the war," he said to Pujol. "They've accepted that sometimes your intelligence will arrive too late, and they'll blame themselves rather than you. When the time comes for the real invasion, we can use that precedent. We can have you report the truth after it's too late to matter, and they'll believe you were trying to warn them, but circumstances prevented it." Pujol understood immediately what Harris meant. Somewhere in the future, perhaps in a year or two, the Allies would launch the invasion of France. When that moment came, Garbo would need to maintain his credibility while not actually compromising the operation. The Torch precedent gave them a template for how to do that. They could have Garbo report accurate intelligence about the invasion after it had begun, Too late for the Germans to respond, but early enough to demonstrate that he had known about it. The Germans would see him as a loyal agent, whose excellent intelligence had been delayed by circumstances beyond his control. But that was for the future. In November 1942, Pujol's immediate task was to continue building his network of ghosts, adding new fictional agents and expanding the web of deception that would eventually help win the war. He returned to his desk and began composing the next message, adding another thread to the tapestry of lies that the Germans believed was truth. Outside the window, London went about its wartime business, unaware that in this modest house in Hendon, a Spanish shopkeeper was creating an invisible army that would help liberate Europe. Colonel David Strangeways stood before a wall-sized map of Europe, studying the disposition of German forces with the intensity of a chess master analyzing a complex endgame. The map was covered with colored pins representing Wehrmacht divisions, each one a potential obstacle to the invasion that would determine the outcome of the war. Strangeways was the chief of operations for our force, the Deception Unit, responsible for Operation Fortitude, the elaborate plan to mislead the Germans about where and when the Allies would invade France. The success or failure of D-Day would depend largely on whether Fortitude could convince Hitler to keep his strongest forces away from Normandy. Strangeways had spent months developing the deception plan, working with a team of intelligence officers, military planners, and creative thinkers who understood that modern warfare was as much about information as firepower. Fortitude consisted of two main components: Fortitude North, which suggested an invasion of Norway, and Fortitude South, which indicated an invasion at Pas-de-Calais. Both were elaborate fictions supported by fake radio traffic, dummy equipment, falsified documents, and carefully controlled intelligence leaks. But the most critical element of the deception was the network of double agents who would feed false information directly to German intelligence. Agent Garbo was the centerpiece of this network. Over the past 18 months, his fictional spy ring had grown to 27 sub-agents, making it the largest and most productive intelligence network the Abwehr believed they had in Britain. Garbo's reports were so detailed and apparently reliable that they were regularly forwarded to the highest levels of German command. Hitler himself had read summaries of Arabel's intelligence. This level of trust made Garbo uniquely valuable for the Fortitude deception, but it also made him uniquely dangerous. If the Germans discovered he was a double agent, the entire deception would collapse. Strangeways turned from the map to face the small group assembled in the operations room. Thomas Harris was there, along with Major Roger Hesketh, who was coordinating the overall Fortitude plan, and Lieutenant Colonel John Bevan, who headed the London controlling section, responsible for strategic deception. Also present was Juan Pujol, who sat quietly in a corner, listening to the discussion of how his fictional agents would be used to deceive an entire army. The meeting had been called to finalize the intelligence that Garbo would provide to the Germans over the next 5 months, leading up to the invasion. The fundamental challenge, Hesketh began, spreading a series of documents across the conference table, is that we need the Germans to believe two things simultaneously. First, that we're planning to invade at Pas-de-Calais. Second, that when we actually land at Normandy, that landing is just a diversion, and the real invasion is still coming at Calais. If we can make them believe both those things, We can keep their strongest forces away from Normandy for weeks after D-Day, giving us time to establish a secure beachhead. Bevan nodded, adding his own analysis. The Germans are expecting an invasion. They know it's coming in 1944, probably in late spring or early summer. They've fortified the entire Atlantic coast, but they can't defend everywhere with equal strength. They need to concentrate their forces where they believe we'll attack. Our job is to make them concentrate in the wrong place. Garbo is our primary tool for accomplishing that, but we need to use him carefully. If we push too hard or make claims that are too specific, they might become suspicious. Harris spoke up, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had worked with Garbo for nearly 2 years and understood his capabilities. Juan has built extraordinary credibility with the Abwehr. They trust him completely. But that trust is based on a pattern of reporting that has been consistent over time. He provides detailed intelligence that is usually accurate, but sometimes arrives too late to be actionable. He makes occasional mistakes that he later corrects. His agents have personal problems that sometimes interfere with their reporting. This realism is what makes him believable. We need to maintain that pattern even as we use him for deception. Strangeways walked to the table and picked up a document labeled Fortitude South Garbo Reporting Schedule. It outlined a carefully choreographed sequence of intelligence reports that Garbo would send to Madrid over the coming months. The reports would gradually build a picture of a massive army group assembling in southeastern England, preparing to invade at Pas-de-Calais. This fictional force, designated the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, would be commanded by General George Patton, whose reputation as an aggressive commander made him a plausible choice to lead the invasion. Garbo's agents will report seeing elements of FUSAG throughout Kent and Sussex, Strangeways explained, pointing to locations on the map. Agent 4 will observe American troops with specific divisional insignia. Agent 7 will report increased radio traffic from military headquarters. Agent 3 will notice supply convoys moving toward embarkation ports. Each piece of intelligence will be accurate in its details, but false in its implications. The troops are real, but they're not preparing to invade at Calais. The radio traffic is real, but it's coming from transmitters, operated by our deception units, not actual headquarters. Pujol listened carefully, occasionally making notes in a small, leather-bound notebook he always carried. He understood that he was being asked to perform the most difficult act of his career as a double agent. For 2 years, he had been building credibility by providing intelligence that was mostly accurate, even if sometimes misleading. Now he would have to provide intelligence that was fundamentally false while maintaining the appearance of accuracy. The margin for error was razor-thin. One mistake, one detail that contradicted something the Germans knew to be true, could destroy everything he had built. "What concerns me," Pujol said quietly, speaking for the first time since the meeting began, "is the question of timing. When do we tell them about FUSAG? If we start too early, they'll have time to investigate and possibly discover the deception. If we start too late, they won't have time to reposition their forces, and the deception will be wasted. We need to find the exact moment when the intelligence will be most effective." Hesketh nodded approvingly. "That's precisely the question we've been wrestling with. Our current thinking is to begin the FUSAG reporting in late February, about 3 months before D-Day. That gives the Germans time to receive the intelligence, analyze it, and make strategic decisions based on it, but not enough time to conduct thorough investigations that might reveal the deception. We'll build the picture gradually, with different agents reporting different pieces of information that collectively point to Calais as the invasion target. Bevan added another consideration. We also need to think about what happens after D-Day. When we land at Normandy on June 6th, the Germans will know that an invasion has begun. But we need them to believe it's not the main invasion. We need them to think that Normandy is a diversion and that the real attack is still coming at Calais. That means Garbeau will need to report, after the Normandy landing, that Fusag is still preparing for the main invasion. This is the most critical phase of the deception, and it's also the most dangerous for Garbeau's credibility. Harris interjected, with a suggestion that had been forming in his mind for weeks. What if we have Garbeau try to warn the Germans about Normandy before it happens, but have the warning arrive too late? We did this successfully with Operation Torch. Garbeau sent accurate intelligence about the North Africa invasion, but it arrived after the landings had begun. The Abwehr blamed themselves for not monitoring their radio frequency, and Garbeau's credibility actually increased. We could do the same thing with D-Day. The room fell silent as the others considered this proposal. It was audacious and risky. If Garbeau sent a message warning about the Normandy invasion before it occurred, even if the message arrived too late to be useful, he would be providing accurate strategic intelligence to the enemy. If something went wrong with the timing, if the message arrived earlier than planned, it could compromise the entire invasion. But if it worked, it would cement Garbeau's credibility at exactly the moment when the Germans needed to believe his subsequent reports about Fusag still preparing to invade at Calais. Strangeways studied the proposal from every angle, looking for flaws. The timing would have to be perfect. We'd need to send the message late enough that it arrives after the invasion has begun, but early enough that it appears Garbeau was trying to warn them in advance. We'd also need to make sure the message contains enough accurate detail to be convincing, but not so much that it provides useful tactical intelligence if it somehow arrives earlier than expected. Pujol spoke again, his voice thoughtful. There's another advantage to this approach. If I warn them about Normandy and the warning arrives too late, they'll feel they missed an opportunity because of their own failure. That emotional response will make them more eager to act on my next intelligence. When I then report that Fusag is still preparing to invade at Calais, they'll be determined not to miss another opportunity. They'll want to redeem themselves by acting on the intelligence they receive in time. The psychological insight impressed everyone in the room. Pujol understood intuitively what intelligence professionals learned through years of experience. Human decisions were driven as much by emotion as by logic. A German intelligence officer who felt he had failed to act on Garbeau's warning about Normandy would be predisposed to believe and act on Garbeau's subsequent intelligence about Calais. The deception would work, not just because the false intelligence was plausible, but because the Germans would want to believe it. Bevan made the decision. We'll proceed with Harris's proposal. Garbeau will send a message warning about Normandy in the early morning hours of June 6th, time to arrive after the invasion has begun. The message will express urgency and frustration that he couldn't get the intelligence to Madrid sooner. Then, within days of D-Day, he'll begin reporting that Fusag is still preparing for the main invasion at Calais. The combination of the late warning about Normandy and the continued reporting about Calais should convince the Germans that Normandy was indeed a diversion. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, working through the details of what each of Garbo's fictional agents would report over the coming months. Agent 4 would observe American troops in Kent. Agent 7 would report radio intercepts suggesting headquarters activity in Sussex. Agent 3 would notice supply convoys moving toward Dover. Each piece of intelligence would be carefully calibrated to support the Fortitude deception, while maintaining the realistic pattern of reporting that had made Garbo credible. By the time the meeting concluded, they had outlined a 5-month campaign of deception that would culminate in the most important message Garbo would ever send. The safe house had become a command center for orchestrated deception. Maps covered every wall, showing the fictional deployment of Fusag across southeastern England. Index cards pinned to corkboards tracked the locations and activities of Garbo's 27 imaginary sub-agents. A filing cabinet contained hundreds of pages documenting the personalities, relationships, and reporting histories of people who existed only in Juan Pujol's imagination and German intelligence files. Thomas Harris sat at one end of the dining table, reviewing the latest intercepts from Bletchley Park that showed how the Abwehr was responding to Garbo's intelligence. Pujol sat at the other end, composing the next message in the carefully orchestrated symphony of lies that would reach its climax in 9 days. Over the past 3 months, Garbo's network had been reporting a steady stream of intelligence about Fusag. Agent 4, the Gibraltarian waiter, had observed American soldiers with the shoulder patches of the 28th Infantry Division in Kent. Agent 7, the former seaman now working as a dock worker in Dover, had reported increased shipping activity and the arrival of landing craft. Agent 3, the Venezuelan commercial traveler, had noticed convoys of military vehicles moving through Sussex toward the coast. Each report was based on genuine observations of real military units and activities. But the interpretation was false. The troops and equipment were real, but they weren't preparing to invade at Calais. They were part of the deception, positioned to be observed by anyone the Germans might have watching. The Germans were believing every word. Intercepts decoded at Bletchley Park showed that Arabelle's intelligence was being forwarded to the highest levels of Wehrmacht command. Hitler's daily intelligence briefings included summaries of Garbo's reports. German military planners were using his intelligence to make strategic decisions about force deployments. The 15th Army, Germany's strongest force in France, remained concentrated at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for the invasion that Garbo's agents kept reporting was coming. The deception was working perfectly, but the most critical phase was still ahead. The Abwehr sent another message today praising your work, Harris said, looking up from the decrypt he was reading. They're calling your network the most valuable intelligence source they have in Britain. They've increased your funding again and asked for more detailed reporting on embarkation schedules. They're completely convinced that Fusag is preparing to invade at Calais. He paused, then added with a slight smile. They have no idea that every soldier they think is preparing to invade Calais is actually either part of the deception or already moving toward Normandy. Pujol nodded, but didn't look up from the message he was composing. He was writing as Agent 7, reporting observations of landing craft being loaded with supplies in Dover Harbor. The message needed to be detailed enough to seem authentic, but vague enough to avoid providing any genuinely useful tactical intelligence. It was a balance he had maintained for 2 years, but the stakes had never been higher. In 9 days, the largest amphibious invasion in history would begin. Everything he had built, all the credibility he had accumulated, would be tested in the hours and days following that landing. "I've been thinking about the warning message," Pujol said, setting down his pen and finally looking at Harris. "The one we'll send on the morning of D-Day. It needs to accomplish several things simultaneously. It needs to arrive too late to be useful, but early enough to show I was trying to warn them. It needs to be accurate enough to prove I had genuine intelligence, but not so detailed that it provides tactical information they could use. And it needs to set up the follow-up messages about Fusag still preparing to invade at Calais." Harris pulled out a draft they had been working on for weeks. The message was scheduled to be transmitted at 300 hours on June 6th, 3 hours after the first Allied paratroopers would land in Normandy, but before the main amphibious assault would begin at dawn. The timing was calculated to ensure the message would arrive after the invasion was underway, but could plausibly have been sent before Garbo knew it had started. The message would report that several of his agents had observed unusual military activity, suggesting an imminent invasion, but that he hadn't been able to determine the exact location or timing until it was too late to provide adequate warning. "The key," Harris explained, "is that the message needs to express frustration and urgency. You need to sound like an agent who discovered critical intelligence but couldn't get it to his handlers in time. That emotional tone will make the Germans feel they missed an opportunity, which will make them more receptive to your subsequent intelligence. When you then report that Fusag is still preparing for the main invasion at Calais, they'll be eager to act on that intelligence to avoid missing another opportunity." Pujol read through the draft message, making small adjustments to the wording. He had an instinctive sense for how his messages should sound, a feeling for the tone and style that would make them most convincing. After 2 years of writing as Arabelle, he had internalized the character completely. He knew how Arabelle would react to different situations, what would make him angry or frustrated or excited. The warning message needed to capture Arabelle's personality while serving the strategic purpose of the deception. "There's something else we need to consider," Pujol said, looking up from the draft. "After I send the warning about Normandy, and then report that Fusag is still preparing to invade at Calais, the Germans will be expecting that invasion to happen soon. What do we tell them when weeks pass and no invasion comes? How do we maintain the deception after D-Day without eventually losing credibility?" It was a question that had troubled the Fortitude planners for months. The deception needed to keep German forces at Calais for as long as possible after D-Day, ideally for several weeks, while the Allies established and expanded their Normandy beachhead. But the longer the supposed Calais invasion was delayed, the more likely the Germans would become suspicious. They needed a plausible explanation for why Fusag would delay its invasion even after the Normandy landing had revealed that Allied forces were in France. Harris had been working on this problem with the Fortitude planning staff. "We'll have your agents report that Fusag's invasion has been postponed because the Normandy landing encountered stronger resistance than expected. We'll suggest that Eisenhower has decided to reinforce Normandy before launching the main invasion at Calais. This gives us a reason for the delay, while maintaining the fiction that Calais is still the primary target. We can stretch this out for weeks, keeping the Germans waiting for an invasion that will never come. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. By suggesting that the Normandy landing had disrupted the timeline for the Calais invasion, they could explain any delay while keeping the Germans focused on defending Calais. The Germans would see what they expected to see: a cautious Allied command adjusting its plans in response to battlefield conditions. They wouldn't realize they were being deceived because the deception matched their assumptions about how military operations worked. Over the next week, Pujol sent a carefully orchestrated series of messages building toward the climax. Agent 4 reported seeing increased activity at military headquarters in Kent. Agent 7 observed landing craft being prepared for embarkation. Agent 3 noticed that American troops were being restricted to their camps, suggesting an operation was imminent. Each message added another piece to the picture of an invasion force preparing to launch. The Germans received this intelligence with growing excitement, believing they were watching the final preparations for the Allied invasion of Europe. On June 3rd, 3 days before D-Day, Garbo sent a message that caused particular excitement in Madrid. Agent 7 reported that he had overheard American officers discussing embarkation schedules for mid-June. The message suggested that the invasion would occur around June 15th, 9 days after the actual D-Day. This false timeline was designed to make the Germans expect the invasion slightly later than it would actually occur, reducing the chance that they would be on maximum alert on June 6th. The Abwehr forwarded this intelligence to Wehrmacht command with high priority, noting that it came from their most reliable source in Britain. But even as Garbo's messages were convincing the Germans to expect an invasion at Calais in mid-June, the real invasion force was moving into position for the Normandy landing. Over 150,000 soldiers were boarding ships and landing craft at ports across southern England. Thousands of aircraft were being prepared for the airborne assault that would begin the invasion. The largest military operation in history was unfolding, and German intelligence was looking in the wrong direction because they believed the reports of a Spanish shopkeeper who had invented an entire spy network from his imagination. On the evening of June 5th, Pujol sat in the safe house, reviewing the warning message one final time. In a few hours, he would transmit the most important message of his career, a message that would arrive too late to prevent the invasion, but would set up the deception that would follow. Everything he had built over 2 years of patient work would be tested in the coming days. If the Germans believed his warning about Normandy and his subsequent reports about Calais, the deception would succeed and thousands of lives would be saved. If they became suspicious, the entire operation could fail. Harris entered the room carrying the latest weather report. The invasion had been delayed by 1 day due to poor weather, but Eisenhower had made the final decision to proceed on June 6th, despite continued marginal conditions. The first paratroopers would begin landing in Normandy shortly after midnight. The amphibious assault would begin at dawn. In a few hours, the fate of Europe would be decided on the beaches of France, and Juan Pujol Garcia would send a message that would help determine the outcome. "It's time," Harris said simply. Pujol nodded, picked up the message he had been preparing for weeks, and walked to the radio transmitter that connected him to Madrid, and through Madrid to the German intelligence service that believed he was their most valuable spy in Britain. He began to encode the message, his hand steady despite the enormity of what he was about to do. In the darkness before dawn, on June 6, 1944, Agent Garbo would send the lie that would help win the war. Juan Pujol's fingers moved across the radio transmitter keys with practiced precision, tapping out the encoded message in Morse code. Each letter was a carefully measured deception, each word a calculated risk. Outside, London slept in the pre-dawn darkness, unaware that across the English Channel, thousands of paratroopers were already descending into the Norman countryside, the vanguard of an invasion that would determine the future of civilization. Inside the safe house, the only sounds were the rhythmic clicking of the transmitter and Thomas Harris's quiet breathing as he stood behind Pujol, watching the most critical moment of the war's greatest deception unfold. The message Pujol was sending had been crafted over weeks of careful deliberation. It warned the Abwehr that his agents had detected signs of an imminent invasion, that unusual military movements suggested a major operation was about to begin. But the warning was deliberately vague about timing and location, and most importantly, it was being sent at precisely the moment when it would arrive too late to matter. By the time the Abwehr decoded the message, analyzed it, and forwarded it to Wehrmacht command, the invasion would be underway, and German forces would already be responding to the landings. Pujol finished transmitting and sat back, his hands finally showing a slight tremor. For 2 years, he had been building toward this moment, constructing an elaborate fiction that the Germans believed was their most valuable intelligence source. Now everything depended on whether they would continue to believe him in the hours and days ahead. If they accepted his warning as genuine but tragically late, his credibility would be intact for the crucial deception that would follow. If they became suspicious, if they questioned why the warning had come so late, or wondered whether Arabelle had been compromised, the entire operation could collapse. "Now we wait," Harris said, lighting a cigarette, with hands that were steadier than Pujol's. The Abwehr should receive the message within the hour. By then, the amphibious assault will be beginning. They'll realize the invasion is happening at Normandy, not Calais. The question is whether they'll believe Normandy is the main invasion or whether they'll accept what we're about to tell them, that it's a diversion. They didn't have to wait long. At 07:20 hours, as the first waves of Allied troops were struggling ashore on the Normandy beaches under withering German fire, the Abwehr's response arrived. Pujol decoded it with hands that had stopped trembling, his professional calm restored by the familiar routine of intelligence work. The message was everything they had hoped for. The Abwehr acknowledged receipt of his warning, expressed regret that it had arrived too late to be acted upon, and asked urgently for any additional intelligence about the invasion's scope and objectives. Most importantly, the message contained no hint of suspicion. The Abwehr accepted that Arabelle had tried to warn them, but that circumstances had prevented the warning from arriving in time. They were treating him exactly as they had after Operation Torch, as a valuable agent whose excellent intelligence had been delayed by factors beyond his control. The precedent they had established 18 months earlier was holding. The Germans were blaming themselves for not receiving the warning in time, not questioning why Arabelle had sent it so late. Harris read the message and allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. They've taken the bait. Now comes the critical part. We need to convince them that Normandy is a diversion, and that the real invasion is still coming at Calais. If we can do that, we can keep the 15th Army sitting at Calais for weeks while the Normandy beachhead is established. Over the next 3 days, Pujol orchestrated the most intensive deception campaign of his career. His fictional agents reported a flurry of intelligence, all carefully designed to support the narrative that Normandy was a feint and that Foussag was still preparing to invade at Pas-de-Calais. Agent 4 reported that American troops in Kent had not been moved, suggesting they were still preparing for their own operation. Agent 7 observed that landing craft in Dover remained in port, indicating they hadn't been used in the Normandy invasion. Agent 3 heard American officers discussing how the Normandy landing was drawing German forces away from the real invasion target. Each message was a masterpiece of calculated ambiguity. The intelligence was specific enough to seem credible, but vague enough to avoid providing details that could be verified or disproven. Pujol was walking a tightrope, maintaining the fiction that Foussag existed and was preparing to invade while the real Allied forces were fighting desperately to expand the Normandy beachhead against fierce German resistance. If the Germans realized the deception, they could shift the 15th Army from Calais to Normandy and potentially drive the Allies back into the sea. On June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, Pujol sent the message that would become the culmination of his career as a double agent. It was a long, detailed report synthesizing intelligence from multiple agents and presenting a comprehensive analysis of Allied intentions. The message acknowledged that a major invasion had occurred at Normandy, but argued that the scale of forces involved was too small to be the main invasion. It pointed to the continued presence of Foussag in southeastern England as evidence that another larger invasion was planned. It suggested that the Normandy landing was designed to draw German reserves away from Calais, where the real invasion would strike once the Germans had weakened their defenses. The message was brilliant in its psychological manipulation. It told the Germans what they wanted to believe, that they had not been completely fooled, that they still had a chance to defeat the invasion by defending the right location. It appealed to their professional pride by suggesting that the Allies were using a sophisticated deception, which implied that German intelligence was sophisticated enough to see through it. Most importantly, it gave them a reason to keep the 15th Army at Calais, rather than sending it to reinforce the desperate battle in Normandy. The German response exceeded even the optimistic projections of the Fortitude planners. On June 10th, Bletchley Park intercepted and decoded a message from Wehrmacht High Command to field commanders in France. The message, based directly on Garbeau's intelligence, ordered the 15th Army to remain at Pas-de-Calais and prepare to repel the main Allied invasion expected in that sector. It specifically cited intelligence from a reliable source, Arabelle, indicating that the Normandy landing was a diversion. The most powerful German army in France, with over 250,000 troops and hundreds of tanks, would remain in place defending against an invasion that would never come. For the next 6 weeks, as Allied forces fought to expand and break out from the Normandy beachhead, the 15th Army sat at Calais, waiting for Foussag to invade. Pujol continued to send reports explaining why the invasion was delayed: logistical problems, weather concerns, the need to reinforce Normandy before launching the main assault. The Germans accepted each explanation because they wanted to believe them. They had committed to the theory that Calais was the real target, and confirmation bias made them interpret every piece of intelligence as supporting that theory. The deception finally began to unravel in late July, when Allied forces broke out from Normandy and began racing across France. By then, it no longer mattered. The critical weeks after D-Day, when the Normandy beachhead was most vulnerable, had passed with the 15th Army sitting uselessly at Calais. By the time the Germans realized they had been deceived, the Allies had established an unbreakable foothold in France and were advancing toward Germany. The war in the West had been won, in large part because Juan Pujol Garcia had convinced the Germans to defend the wrong beach.